Star Trek Prodigy, A Dangerous Trade. Chapter 5. I still don't think we should go in there. Rock Tuck stared at the big metal door set into the stone building. There's no sign or anything. How do we even know it's a shop? It's probably not a shop, Dal said, but there's someone in there who's willing to trade with us. Trust me. I don't like this, Rock Tuck said nervously. I don't either. Zero zipped back over to the group, a faint tremor in their voice. Plus, I think someone's watching us. Zero pointed to the opening of the alley, and the whole group turned to look. No one was there. It's fine, Dal said. Come on, let's get inside. He stepped up to the door and pulled it open, the metal grinding and groaning. Inside, faint twinkling music played softly, but it was too dark for Dal to see much else. Hello? He called out, stepping across the doorway. Is there anyone here? He had stepped into a small, dim room. It looked like a waiting room. It was empty, save for a few tattered chairs, and there was a door set into the far wall. Dal stuck his head back outside. It's fine, he said. Come on. Jankum bounded in first, his heavy feet clomping on the floor. Fafnir Avant is here, he bellowed. Dal rolled his eyes, went up to the closed door and knocked twice. Hello? He called out. We have some... The door swung open, and a towering woman stepped into the doorway. Her long black hair was teased up over her fierce, bony face, and two tusks jutted sideways out of her mouth. Yes? She said sharply. What do you want? Dal took a deep breath. The woman might be intimidating, but he and his crew were here for a reason. We're looking to trade, he said, straightening his shoulders. The woman arched an eyebrow. Is that so? Well, I am a trader. She pressed her hand to her heart and gave a shallow bow. My name is Talus, and you? Tad, Dal lied. My friends and I... We're looking for a transporter phase coil. Talus broke into a wide grin. I think we may be able to help each other then. Come, join me. She stepped back through the doorway, disappearing into the shadows. Dal turned and gestured to the others. Come on, he whispered. Are you sure about this? Jankum said, his eyes wide. She said she has phase coils. Come on. Technically, Zero said. She said she might be able to help us. Dal rolled his eyes. Rock Tuck, come with me. Rock Tuck sighed and shuffled forward, the battery case cradled in one hand. What's taking so long? Talus reappeared in the doorway, her gaze sharp as she looked around at the crew. You said you wanted to trade. Let's trade. Nothing's wrong. Dal whirled around to face Talus, who glowered down at him. We were just coming, weren't we? Talus fixed the crew with a dark, searing glare. Dal was relieved when he heard the shuffle of feet behind him as he began to move toward the door. Talus stepped aside to let him pass, and he walked into a large room. It felt to Dal like the storage bay on the Protostar. Most of the space was taken up by large, unmarked crates, and figures shuffled around the room, scanning the crates with pads and then loading the crates onto a small transporter platform. The others stepped into the room behind Dal. Rock Tuck clutched the case as tightly as she could, feeling overwhelmed by the size of the space. Zero stuck close behind her, concerned when they saw the group wasn't entering an actual shop, but rather some kind of storage facility. Even Jankum stayed quiet, deciding it was better to keep Fafnir Avant tucked away for the time being. Come, have a seat. Talus led them all over to a desk shoved up against a far wall near the transporter. There were only 2 chairs set up in front of the desk. Jankum grabbed one immediately, his eyes on the transporter. Talus's associates had just loaded up one of those unmarked crates, and it shimmered away, the air chiming in its wake. Its phase coils were working properly then. Where are you sending those things? Jankum asked. Talus glared at him. That's of no concern to you. Of course not. Dal slid into the other empty chair, a bright grin plastered on his face. Talus fixed her glare onto him. You can ignore him. He's just like that. Hey, Jenkum shouted. What does that mean? Zero flitted up to Jankum. It's probably best we keep quiet, they said softly, gently patting Jankum's knee with one hand. Jankum Pog was just curious, Jankum muttered back. Dal took a deep breath, hoping that was the end of it. Talus leaned back in the chair, her arms crossed over her chest. You said you need a phase coil, she said. What do you have to trade for it? Dal swallowed, then glanced over at Rock Talk. Her eyes were wide with fear. A Starfleet-issued ground vehicle battery, he said, speaking with a confidence he didn't feel. Never used. Never used? Talus's eyes went wide. And how did you come across such a thing? Dal could feel the others watching him, waiting for his response. Talus folded her hands over her stomach, her expression mocking. Beside him, Jankum shifted in his chair, and that's when Dal was struck with inspiration. A treasure hunter never reveals his secrets, he said. It's true, Jankum started, but Dal shot out his arm and squeezed his wrist, stopping him from saying anything else. Treasure hunters, huh? Talus chuckled. So you're thieves. We're not thieves, Rock Talk said indignantly. Dal whipped his head around to shush her. Thieves, treasure hunters, defected Starfleet officers, I don't care. Talus tossed her long black hair over her shoulder. I know how to be discreet. I'd like to see this vehicle battery. Dal hesitated. He'd been in enough negotiations with people of questionable ethics to know he needed to tread carefully. My associate here has the battery, tucked away for safekeeping. Dal patted Rock Talk on the arm, and she looked over at him nervously. He nodded at her, then at the carrier. Oh, Rock Talk said. Yes, it's in here. She lifted the case and reached for the latch. Should I? Not yet. Dal leaned forward over Talus's desk. I want to see the phase coil first, he said. Then we'll show you the battery. Talus stared at him for a long moment. Dal fidgeted, certain she was going to throw him and the rest of his crew back out on the street. But then she let out a loud, shrieking laugh. Ah, smart, she said. You know what you're doing. She snapped her fingers and shouted over at the people loading the crates onto the transporter. Transporter coil, now! One of the workers, a Klingon, immediately walked over to a stack of crates on the other side of the warehouse, pried one open, and pulled out a small metal device. He set it on Talus's desk. That's it, Jenkum shouted. That's what we need. Dal hissed at him to be quiet. Talus chuckled. I told you that we'd be able to help each other. Now! She yanked the phase coil away from Jankum. It was reaching out to grab it. He gave a soft groan of disappointment. Dal just hoped she wouldn't hold it against them. Let's see that battery. Her eyes glittered. If it really is in as good condition as you claim, I'll be happy to hand over this phase coil. Brand new, manufactured right here on Odaru. The battery's in perfect condition, Dal said, his heart fluttering excitedly in his chest. The plan was all falling into place. He turned to Rock Talk. If you would be so kind. Rock Talk nodded and looped the case up over her head. She settled it in her lap and pulled open the lid, and then immediately snapped it shut again. She said, terror coursing inside her. Just a trick of the light. It's dark in here. Any time now, Dal said through a strained smile. Rock Talk stared down at the case. She could feel tears forming behind her eyes. Rock Talk? Dal hissed angrily. With a soft, miserable whine, Rock Talk lifted the lid up and held the case over so Dal could see inside. The battery was gone. In its place was a pile of stones and scrap metal. What's going on? Snarled Talus, drawing herself over the desk. Where's the battery? It's, well... But Dal wasn't fast enough to come up with an excuse. Talus's hand snapped out and grabbed the case, dragging it over the desk. When she saw what was inside, she let out a fearsome shriek of rage. "How dare you!" she roared, throwing the case across the room. It landed with a clatter, the rubble spilling out across the floor. "The battery!" Jenkum yelled. "Jenkum Pog repli—" Dal elbowed him hard in the side. "It was in there," he said quickly. "I swear to you, my associate here, she never let it out of her sight." Talus fixed her fearsome gaze onto Rock Talk, who cringed backward, whimpering. It's true," she stammered. "I don't understand." Zero fluttered over beside her, stroking her shoulder. "It's okay," they murmured softly, thinking again about the flutter of a black cloak they saw in the alley, right before they stepped into Talus's warehouse. "You wasted my time!" Talus roared. "And no one wastes the time of Talus Uskus!" She launched herself over the table and grabbed Dal's arm, yanking him to his feet. Before he could so much as shout in surprise, the workers swarmed around his crew, grabbing them as roughly as Talus had grabbed him. He realized with a slow dread that they must have been watching their conversation the whole time, ready to act the second it went wrong. "Tie them up!" Talus ordered. "We'll show them what happens when you try to cheat me." "We weren't trying to cheat you," Dal shouted, struggling against her grip. "It's true," Zero shouted, flailing against their own captor. "Someone was following us. They must have done something." Zero's captor looped an energy cord around Zero's containment unit, making it sputter and spark. "Hey," Dal said, "don't hurt them." The captor just snarled in response. Talus jerked on Dal's arm, dragging him deeper into the warehouse. Talus's subordinates had made quick work of Jankum and Rock Talk, both of them wrapped in glowing energy ropes. Suddenly, Dal felt the sizzle of energy on his own skin. "Hey!" he shouted, trying to wriggle free. But Talus had already looped the rope completely around his wrists. "I think sometime in the golden crate will be good for you," Talus said with a smirk. "The what?" Fear lanced through Dal's chest. Talus tugged on the rope, forcing him to trip after her. The others were dragged along behind him. Jankum shouted his protests, thrashing against his bindings. Zero sputtered against the energy rope, still trying to quietly plead with her captor to let all of them go. Rock Talk was crying softly, stumbling along after her own captor. Too late, Dal realized he should have called to Gwyn on his communicator badge, but with his bound hands he couldn't even do that. "The golden crate," Talus said proudly, jerking Dal around. The crate wasn't a crate at all, but a cage, and it wasn't golden either, although it was a kind of burnished coppery color. It had clearly been made from welding together scrap parts and old metal that had been melted down and remolded, and the effect was that it looked lumpen, distorted, and terrible. Talus slammed open the door and threw Dal inside. Jankum came rolling in next, scrambling to his feet as soon as he could. Like Dal, his hands were bound behind his back. "You'll regret this!" Jankum shouted. "You'll regret throwing Jankum Pog in this piece of old garbage!" Zero flew in and landed with a shudder on the ground, their containment unit still sputtering from the rope. Rock Talk trudged in last. She looked down at the others with wet eyes. "I'm sorry," she said in a small voice. "I don't know what happened." Talus banged the door shut, hard enough that the entire cage rattled. She locked it with a slim metal key that activated an energy shield, which exploded around the perimeter of the cage. Dal could hear it thrumming. "We can get you another battery," he shouted, but Talus only laughed. She lifted up one hand, the key dangling from her finger. "No," she said. "I think this is a much better trade." Chapter 6. Dal watched Jankum fling himself against the bars of the cage, making the whole thing rattle. He'd been doing it for the past 10 minutes, ever since Talus hung the key to the cage's lock on the wall just out of reach. Not that any of them could reach the key with their hands tied, and that was the real reason Jankum was making such a racket, to distract from what Dal was doing. "Let us out!" Jankum shouted dramatically, slamming his body against the cage so hard the back lifted up. Dal held his bound hands positioned just right so that the sharp side of one of the bars there snagged on the rope.
"It's working. Keep at it." "Free us!" Jankum bellowed.
"Yes, please." Rock Talk wedged her shoulder up against the cage with enough force that it scraped across the floor. Dal felt his rope splinter even farther. Talus stood over by the transporter, barking orders at her crew as they continued to transport crate after crate. But when she heard the cage scraping along the floor, she whipped her head over. Dal froze, keeping his hands tied behind his back.
"You two are making an awful racket," Talus said coldly.
She loped toward them, her face twisted in anger.
"It's making it very hard for my crew to concentrate on their work."
The crew in question stared dolefully over at the cage.
"Then let us out," Jankum said. "Jankum Pog can make you a new battery."
"Jankum," Zero gasped, but Talus chuckled.
"Make me a new battery?"
She arched an eyebrow, the anger in her expression washing over into amusement.
"Is that all you think the Protostar is good for?"
Every single one of them, Dal and Rock Talk, Jankum and Zero, froze in place. Dal could feel the others looking over at him, could feel their confusion staining the air. Talus grinned, her tusks gleaming.
"I suppose there's no harm in telling you now."
As she marched over to the cage, she grabbed a chair and dragged it with her, swinging it around to position it directly in front of where Rock Talk was still pressed against the cage bars. Talus sat down, leaning back, with one leg propped haphazardly on the cage. When Jankum lunged at her, she kicked it away, laughing. "How do you know about the Protostar?" Dal stood up, arranging his hands so the ropes would pass over the sharp, jagged edge of the bar one last time. To his relief, he felt the rope snap and fall away. He grabbed the loose end before it could dangle down, and he kept his hands behind him. It was something to have even this small thing work out in his favor. As soon as Talus looked away, he'd be able to get the other's hands untied too. Talus tilted her head to the side, eyes glittering.
"Well, Tagras there detected your ship's warp signature when you landed on Odaru."
She gestured over at one of her crew, a tall, lanky Klingon who snarled a little at the mention of his name.
"We have a whole setup in the back, looking for interesting ships to plunder."
Off to Dal's side, Zero let out a loud gasp, and Dal felt the same sickening dread. "You were tracking us all along," Zero said, "weren't you?" Talus grinned. Then she jumped to her feet and walked off. "They know about the Protostar," Rock Talk cried, whirling around. "What are we going to do?" Dal fought back his own sense of terror and gave Rock Talk and the others a rakish smile. He glanced over at Talus, who had pried open one of the crates sitting next to her desk. Angling himself behind Rock Talk, he showed his crew his untied hands. Jankum started to yell, but Rock Talk nudged him hard enough that he quickly fell silent. "Yes, but don't let them know," Dal said. Talus had pulled something out of the crate and turned back toward the cage. "Quick, she's coming back over here." Dal quickly rearranged his hands behind his back again, just as Talus came striding over to the cage and sat down in the chair. As soon as she'd approached, he saw what she had pulled out of the crate. "Our battery!" Rock Talk cried. "How did you—"
"Oh, give it a think,"
Talus said, her grin sharp and cruel.
"I'm sure even you could figure it out."
"Don't speak to her like that," Zero said, zipping over to Rock Talk's side. But Rock Talk had figured it out. She'd been running after Jankum in the market. Someone had bumped her, and the case flew out of her hands. "It was just a second," she whispered, "and the case never left my sight. How—" Talus made a clicking sound, and one of her crew, a lizardy-looking fellow in a black coat, let out a high, yipping noise that might have been laughter. Tagras the Klingon joined in.
"Micro-transporter," Talus said sharply.
Her crew's laughter stopped. She pointed at the man in the dark coat.
"Ioma there just had to get the case away from you long enough to transport the battery into my office. Tagras was waiting to transport the rocks a second later. That," her grin widened, "is how he did it."
"That black coat," Zero cried, fluttering up to the edge of the cage. "Ioma was following us, wasn't he? Into the alley." Talus nodded.
"You're a smart one, Medusan. I had him follow you in case Chadosa wasn't enough to lure you in. Which reminds me," she leaned back her head, "Chadosa, you can come out now. We've got them."
Not a single one of Dal's crewmates was surprised when the Caitian woman in the purple coat burst through one of the far doors.
"But Ioma didn't need to be there, did he?" she said, her whiskers bristling. "I told you I could handle the job on my own."
Ioma hissed something at her, and she hissed back. Whatever they said wasn't recognized by the crew's translators.
Yes, you did marvelously," Talus said, sounding annoyed. "Now put this battery back in the case."
Chadosa strutted over, looking, Dal thought, immensely pleased with herself. She gave him a wink as she plucked the battery out of Talus's hand. "If you think my little act in the market was good," she purred, "wait until you see how fast I strip your ship." "What?" Dal squawked, surging forward, and remembering at the last minute that his hands were still supposed to be tied. "No," he said more calmly, keeping his arms stuck close behind him. "You'll never get aboard the Protostar." Talus and Chadosa glanced at each other for a moment, then burst into laughter.
"How exactly do you plan to stop us?"
Talus said. "How do you plan to get aboard?" Dal countered. "You really think we'd leave our ship completely unprotected?"
"This isn't our first time raiding a ship," Talus said, rising from her chair. "And the fact of the matter is that you are currently locked in a cage, hands tied, key," she nodded toward the key, where the key hung on the wall, "just out of reach, while all we have to do is get past your shields."
Talus bared her teeth, a smile that was more of a threat than anything else.
"I think we have the upper hand."
She whirled away, marching back over to her desk. Chadosa gave Dal and his crew one last smirk before following, her tail whipping around after her. For half a second, everyone was quiet. Then they all immediately turned around to Dal.
"What are we going to do?"
Jankum cried, looking more miserable than ever. "I can't believe I let them steal the battery," Rocktalk said, shoulders slumped. "It was only a second, and I checked it." "It wasn't your fault," Zero said gently. "The same thing could have happened to any of us."
"Who cares about the battery?" Jankum shouted. "The ship! We have to figure out what to do about the ship."
"Keep your voice down," Dal said, flicking his gaze over to Talus. Thankfully, she and the rest of her gang seemed to be ignoring them, but Dal knew that didn't mean they weren't listening in. He lifted his gaze to the worried faces of his crew. "Be quiet," he said, "and act normal. Rocktalk, move over to the left a little." "Why?" She blinked in confusion. Dal grinned up at her. "Just trust me, okay? But I need you to block their view for a second." "Oh." Rocktalk shuffled over to the left-hand corner of the cage. "Is that—" "Perfect. Jankum, come over here on her right." Jankum did as he was asked without so much as a peep, for which Dal was extremely grateful. "What should I do?" Zero asked. "Come fill in the gap there." Dal nodded in approval as Zero slid into place. Now that he was hidden by his friends, he finally brought his hands around in front of him. "Don't act weird," he reminded them in a short, sharp voice, cutting off at least one delighted gasp from Rocktalk. "I still can't believe that worked," she said happily.
"Jankum Pog knows how to throw his weight around."
Jankum nudged Rocktalk's side. She just scowled in response. "Don't move," Dal said. "But Jankum, I need you to start shouting about something."
"What?" Jankum frowned. "You told Jankum Pog to be quiet."
"I know, but I can't have the traitors hearing Gwyn's voice, can I?" And with a triumphant flourish, Dal whipped his comm badge out of his pocket. "So I need you to make some racket. Nothing that'll bring them over here, but enough that they won't hear her when she responds."
"Ah, now that Jankum Pog can do."
Immediately he banged his multi-mitt on the cage bars.
"We'll never get out of here," he wailed. "And now we're stuck on this crummy planet."
"Agreed," Zero said, joining in on the clamor. They were much more soft-spoken than Jankum, but every little bit helped. And when Rock Talk chimed in with a perfectly pitched, "I want to go home," Dal knew it was time to act. He hit the comm badge and held it up to his mouth so he could speak in a whisper. "Gwyn," he said, "answer me. We've got a problem. Gwyn!" He held the badge up to his ear, waiting. His heart hammered fast in his chest. "Gwyn?" he hissed. Then her voice came through, faint but clear. "Dal?" He breathed with relief and sneaked a glance over at Rock Talk, who had taken to fake crying about being locked in the cage. A perfect cover. Talus wasn't paying the cage any attention either, just digging through one of the crates. "I don't have time to explain," he said softly, ducking back behind Rock Talk. "But you need to be ready. Some traitors. They saw the Protostar's energy signature. They want to raid the ship." He held the comm badge by his ear. There was no response. "Gwyn!" he said, a little more loudly than he should have. Over the din of his crewmates, Dal heard Talus calling out to her subordinates.
"Bring the pulse rifles!"
Dal brought the comm badge back down to his mouth. "Gwyn, answer me," he said. "They're going to—" "I'm not at the ship." Gwyn's voice came through, tinny and small. Dal froze, looking up at the others in a panic. It was clear from their expressions that they had heard too. "I'm sorry," Gwyn said. "I came down to the market. Murph's with me." Dal curled his hand around the comm badge, muffling Gwyn's voice as the voices of the others drifted into silence.
"Did Jankum Pog hear that right?"
Jankum stared at Dal.
"Gwendolyn left her post?"
Gwyn's voice spilled out of the badge. "Dal, I'm sorry. We're in a warehouse. We came in through an alley. Find us. Dal, I can't talk anymore. They've got us tied up, and I can't let them know we have a comm badge." Dal squeezed the badge in his fist and looked up at the others. "What are we going to do?" Rock Talk asked. And Dal didn't have an answer.